Well, I think it's a very important resolution, Resolution 1973, that is providing an authorization to use all the necessary force to protect civilians in Libya. This is an important resolution to the extent that it provides basically a authorization for military intervention, primarily through the use of air force and imposing a no-fly zone, but beyond that also to intervene militarily into Libya as a way of protecting civilians. Now, it's important to see that this resolution is not taking side in the conflict, in the hostilities. On the contrary, it remains silent on the claims of the opposition about the democratization process, or even about the movement across the Arab world. It limits itself to the protection of civilians. And I believe it's mostly because the Western world, the members of the Security Council from the West, do not want to appear like interfering in domestic affairs in the Middle East. It's still open, therefore, to see how the international community can support the democratization of Libya. What it says, it imposes certain limitations to say civilians' lives should not be endangered. But what will happen next is still to be seen.
Mm-hmm. And that's the point, no? It was practically a surprise, the decision of the United Nations, no? Because Russia didn't want it, China didn't want it.
I think the culture of the United Nations has changed over the recent decade. That is, in the early 1990s, for example, intervening into the affairs of Libya to protect civilians would not have been acceptable. Nowadays, there's a clear understanding that the Security Council has an obligation to intervene to protect civilians from genocide, crime against humanity, or war crimes. However, it remains that the states and the Security Council should not intervene into the domestic affairs of any member of the United Nations unless it threatens international peace and security. Now, the transformation of the Libyan regime, the reform that should take place, is not a matter for the international community to get involved into. It's a matter for the Libyan population and administration and governments to be working on. So the Security Council stays away from these issues, and this is where Russia and China and other members of the Security Council have abstained. They're not opposed to this point. They have abstained in a way they recognize the importance of protecting civilians, but they want to make sure they have not supported what will come next. So by abstaining to support, they in fact keep their cards in a future resolution where, for example, the United Nations may be called to provide a police force for Libya, for example. We don't know what will happen. Well, the member who have abstained cannot be told, well, you supported the first one, so you have to support the second one. You have to be logical here. They say, no, we did not support it. We can still look at it freely to decide if we support or not further involvement in Libya.
Do you think the air restriction will be useful for ending the war?
It was seen from the beginning that a no-fly zone, like in the case there was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, during the 1990s war, is clearly insufficient. But it's an important element. That is, it's to restrict the capacity of the Libyan military to attack populations in rebel control area. And in this context, it's an important measures, but it doesn't deal with the aspect that the rebels and the population may be affected otherwise by artillery, by infantry, etc. So the resolution calls for a no-fly zone, but it also provides the authorization to use all other necessary force, with the exception of occupation force, and that's an important point here. It doesn't prohibit the use of ground troops. It says these ground troops should not occupy the territory. It's an important point here to see. Occupation is a very political issue, it's not a factual one. For example, if the majority of states would recognize the National Council of the Opposition as being the legitimate authority of Libya, and this council invites ground forces, this is not an occupation. This is simply, like in the case of Afghanistan, the invasion of the US troops in Afghanistan was not an occupation. It was invited by the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So it's a political terminology here to say that ground forces would enter or intervene in Libya, if ever, only on the invitation of a government recognized by the international community.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, we'll have to wait some days for see what happens in the future, the immediate future. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. In Tunisia and Egypt, these revolutions were in peace, but in more or less in peace. No? But in Libya, it has been a civil war. Why? Which is the difference between these countries?
I think it's the way the power structure is built. In the case of Libya and Tunisia, there was a traditional state where the dominant political force was civilian and did not have a full control over the military. That is, the military was an autonomous professional entity, military and police, and there's one point where the military and police says we will not shoot on our own people. In the case of Libya, the military, and part of the military, there are some units which are a form of mercenaries, and the tribal delineation within the military makes that some of the military have enormous to lose in the current political crisis, and therefore enter into the conflict. It's a distinct feature of Libya, the tribalism within the society and the military, and the type of control, the tribal character of the government over a certain part of the military. So it's a civil war because there is such a delineation even within the military, because some part of the military did defect to the opposition side. So the division cut across the military, which was not the case in Egypt or the case in Tunisia.
There are other countries that now they are fighting, there are revolutions, there are people protesting, there are demonstrations. Do you think these countries will be either Egypt or Tunisian, or they will be the example of Libya?
Well, I think many parties and government are looking at the situation in Libya, because there is a synergetic force of a wave going across these countries, saying if it was possible in Egypt, a country of 80 million people, it's certainly possible in my country, being Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, that this pressure for reform, because this is the same problem we have. We have a bulging youth. 60% of the population is below 25 years old, and there is little opportunities for these individuals against a often nepotistic, authoritarian generation of old leaders that wants to hang to power. So it's a generational conflict and a demographic conflict to a large extent, and it's the power of numbers. Yes, so the lessons of Egypt and Tunisia and the use of social networking have allowed the mobilization of a mass of individuals and force change. However, if leaders entrench themselves into their fortress, into their military, and creating really military divide around their power structure, it creates violence, and then it's the game changer. Who is ready to go demonstrate on Tahrir Square, or who's ready to lose their life on the battlefield is an entirely different story. So I think that many countries are looking at Libya. If the Gaddafi government managed to restore a traditional order in Libya, it may empower other leaders in other countries to become much firmer against the youth and making much more of a stark choice for the individual in Bahrain, for example. Now, to conduct a demonstration in Bahrain is a life-threatening activity. However, if the international intervention in Libya tipped the balance toward a further democratization, then the governments in Yemen, in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and other locations will get the message. That is, if there's enough pressure from the street, they may be an international intervention. So Libya is a strategic case currently for the democratization of the whole region.
And if Gaddafi wins, it will be possible to go back to the dictatures in Tunisia or Egypt.
I think if Gaddafi wins the battle, it doesn't win the war. I think the legitimacy of the regime in Libya is basically gone. You know, when a government turns its tanks on its own people, it loses all its legitimacy for decades to come. I don't think it would threaten the achievements of Tunisia and Egypt, but it will threaten the possibility of achieving further democratization in Bahrain, in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, in Lebanon, and Syria. This is where the stakes are. I think Tunisia and Egypt have crossed that bridge, and they are not coming back.
Some people compares this situation to the fall of the wall in 1989 in Berlin. Do you think we can compare that way?
To some extent, we have similarities. A large number of people come and demonstrate and impose a popular will, but we have also significant differences. The fall of the Berlin Wall was part of the dynamic of the creation of Europe, of reuniting Germany, of going back to borders that existed prior to the Cold War and to World War II. It's another dynamic we have here. It's not a dynamic of increasing trade between East and West. It's a dynamic of making governments accountable, primarily. And also, the demographic dimension was absent in the case of Eastern Europe. It was a call for freedom and re-engagement with the rest of Europe, while in the case of the Middle East, it's a call of freedom and for jobs. According to the World Bank, the Middle East government needs to create over 80 million jobs in the next 15 years simply to keep the level of unemployment at 15%. Even these new democratic governments have little means to achieve such a demand. So we're facing here a collapse of the old regime, but it's not clear at all how a new regime can establish stable government, prosperous economy. As in the case of Europe, the pathway was pretty well established with the integration into the larger European Union. Now in the Middle East, the pathway to provide job, housing, healthcare for these millions of people is not clear at all.
And what will happen? Because if these young people that wanted democracy and jobs obtains democracy but not jobs, what will they think? Well,
it's for everybody to guess, but my sense is the way the revolution or the spring revolution of the Middle East is taking place give an indication of the potential for development, which is a different model that we've seen in other countries. That is, there is a real social capital available in the Middle East, which is an educated youth. This educated youth need to be mobilized. But it won't be by the opening of massive manufacturing sectors. It will be in the 21st century mode of social enterprise, of communication, migration, new trade, new form of trades. This 50% of the population coming in age of becoming productive citizens will be productive in an economy that doesn't exist yet. But they will create it. They will create it as a small enterprise. They will create it as connected to global trade and communication. It's you see, it's a very interesting element that the traditional source of the model of society has been Islamic groups providing, oh, this is how the future should be, an Islamic state, an Islamic mode of life oriented toward the community, some kind of a looking back into our values and history. This has not led the movement we see. It's much more one of opening up, of trying to reach out to the diversity of the society across class, across religion in some cases. So this diversity and opening is a form of new liberalism, if I may say, that is very promising for economic development. Now, how this development will actually take place, it needs capital, it needs markets, it needs investments to create productive patterns. But what was the first requirement was we needed an open mind and an open market for exchange and ideas, a new mindset for development of the Middle East, a new Middle East. And this is what is emerging in front of our eyes.
One last question. Do you think all this movement will arrive to the connection, the relation between Israel and Palestine?
This is a very interesting question, and somehow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the result of the former paradigm. That is a paradigm of states and old, sometimes regime that lacked democracy by displacing the concern toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yes, there is a conflict that needs to be resolved peacefully in West Bank and Gaza and dealing with Israel, but this is an Israeli-Palestinian issue. The involvement of the Middle East was mostly dictated by the inability of the governments to become more democratic. Now that has changed. Most probably, government will be less attentive of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and probably leaving more space for these governments, being Palestinians or Israeli, to find their own path to find a solution.
Mm-hmm. But now there are people in Gaza protesting against their own government, yeah, and not against Israel.
Yes.
That means something is changing.
As they should. It's the same thing in the West Bank. But the capacity of government in Gaza or West Bank to do anything about their situation is extremely limited. It's the occupation of Gaza and West Bank is such a dramatic constraint on social development that what is required is finding a solution to the political issue of the conflict and settling for once the border of these two states and opening up trade and opening up movement. The way Gaza is being totally isolated for more than a decade is unacceptable. So the problem is not of course we may have issues with the Hamas government in Gaza regarding some of its policies, but the actual problem is the inability of people in Gaza to engage in trade with the rest of the world. And if given a choice, this is what people in West Bank Gaza want, is to free themselves from occupation.
At least what is your personal, emotional situation about all these movements?
Oh, I'm very interested and excited to see how it's taking place. The fact that there is, in fact, no evidence of foreign implications. It's actually a social movement emerging, and that free social capital. The fact that community are interested again about their fate, about their environment, cleaning up the streets, providing attention to their children, thinking about the future in a different way. This is enormous hope that is coming up, despite the enormous challenges they face on the short term in Libya and the long term across the Middle East. But we have a mass of individuals that are ready to rise up to the challenge.